Kwe Washia, hello everyone. Welcome to the third webinar on protected areas that will cover Indigenous protected and conserved areas. My name is Christelle Rosier and I'm a Conservation Project Officer at the FNQL SDI. I'm here today also with my colleague, Pascal Ayotte, who's also a Conservation Project Officer at the FNQL SDI. Thank you all for being here today in such great numbers and for welcoming us to your territories. Today's webinar is part of the FNQL SDI's Nature Conservation and Protection Project, which aims to encourage First Nation involvement in the conservation of biodiversity and natural environments. This webinar is organized in collaboration with CIPAS Quebec and the David Suzuki Foundation. I will let our collaborators present themselves with first Mélissa Mollen-Dupuis from the David Suzuki Foundation and then Véronique Bussière from CIPAS Quebec. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Mélissa Mollen-Dupuis. I am an Innu Hermekwan Chit. I'm in Montreal. Living in Montreal, I'm in charge of the Boreal campaign at the David Suzuki Foundation for 2 years now. Mobilization with the public, also connected to the decolonization of the environmental protection process and reconciliation within the organization and our participants. So you can imagine that I've got a lot of ground to cover. But one of the things that's very important for me is Indigenous protected areas. This is a widely discussed project and also widely ignored as well. And it's normal because it's a process that's being created. It's determined more and more linked to the fact that there is a reconciliation work to be done and also work discovery between the provinces and the Indigenous communities in Quebec. We have a Francophone reality, which is different. I hope I'll be able to cover many of the aspects of Indigenous protected areas. We have a subject which is very exciting and very promising. And I'll be trying to convince you of this because this is a new way of approaching a protected area. So I'll leave the floor to my colleague from SNAP Quebec, Véronique. Hello, everybody. Wachia, thank you. I am in charge of biocultural projects in SNAP Quebec. I work in Indigenous conservation of protected areas. I've been working in this field for about 20 years. For those who were in the last weeks, were the ones who did the seminars on protected areas. I'm very looking forward to what Mélissa has to say because it's a subject that's very dear to me. It's very important to me. And we're in a moment we have a great opportunity to open new and interesting projects for Indigenous conservation. And just to give you a presentation of SNAP in Quebec, for those who don't know this, but I think you were all there in the last weeks, but SNAP is an organization. We have chapters in each province or all the territories of Canada. And we work in Quebec. We work on endangered species and in partnership with different stakeholders. We work with other Indigenous organizations as well. Quebec, we work in partnership with working in the south of Quebec, with also with non-native partners. So our role is to support groups that wish to set up protected areas. So Mélissa, I'll leave the floor to you. Christelle wants to say something. I just want to introduce the agenda and the proceedings for the agenda today. So this will be in 2 blocks. We have each of these blocks. We have 3 themes to be addressed. At the first one, there will be a 10-minute break. In the first block, we'll address the theme of the participation of the community, Indigenous governance, land use, and management planning. And then there's a break, and then we'll have the second block where Mélissa will talk about managing industrial disturbance, establishing a healthy economy for sustainable livelihoods, and finally, operational challenges. To ensure we have enough time to have your questions, we'll ask you to leave your questions at the end for the discussion period. And note with the webinar will be a bit different from the first two. There won't be any PowerPoints as visual support. We'll have videos to allow the communities to speak. Then we'll send you the video link and also links towards the reports that Mélissa will be referring to. If all is going well, I'll leave the floor to Mélissa. Thank you for this presentation. That's why I was a bit nervous today because Véronique made very well-rounded presentations with the PowerPoint. I want to take an approach which is a little bit closer to the reality of First Nations, but however, we have visual support and I'll invite you to read these. If you're interested in this, we'll send you the links. We have the ICE report expert committee, which is one of the more condensed reports on protected areas, and also the foundation's report, which is a work tool to work with the ICE report. These 2 documents will allow us to present the concept of protected areas And this will not answer all our questions, of course, as I said at the beginning. I don't want to try to put a legal framework on a concept that's under development and that is fluid within the communities and which is quite diversified. So to begin, I'll say that many times, we'll talk about the participation of the community in protected areas. It's very important to put forward because within an Indigenous protected area, which we also call tribal parks in English, and the community within the protected area will need more of involvement of the community. It's more than a typical non-native community would, the involvement of non-native communities. Let's say the park is a system before. Now we're set the rules, but now we're going to allow the communities to put forward projects that we wish to support. And it's important to remember that seeing as we are native groups either on or off reserve, depending on the provinces and territories and different legal considerations. We are the collective bearers of ancestral rights, and these are put forward in the communities. Contrary to what was in the past, we favored the development of ideologies of individual property, and that's difficult when we will enter into a connection with the governments or the non-native communities, because when we're talking about ancestral rights, it's a ancestral management right in a group as opposed to property rights. This is a quite new concept, and we saw this for many people. And we saw the issue around the Wet'suwet'en, where we bring out the idea that there are two forms of governance within the same community. There's traditional governance and governance that comes from the band council in chief. So it's very important to put forward, not just because those will become resources for mobilization on the territory of a protected area, and they're also the bearers of histories, and they are groups that will mobilize as much as we can around protected areas. And this activity will also be the bearer of a mission, which will be to protect a territory. This will come with the ideology that we don't all have the same idea of what the territorial protect is, and this ideology is carried forward with this ancestral knowledge, which requires the contribution of each individual in the collectivity, in the community. So your community becomes the project leader, will be putting forward the project. I have the example of Ekwanchit in Manga. That's the one where I'm the most involved, but this project started because these two ladies were reconnected to the territory after a rafting expedition down the Magpie River. So they started to gather the community's knowledge and consult the community for their interest in the project. So what they were doing on this territory, the families, how the families were involved, will really be at the center of this project. The community, whereas people will put the territory or the economy as a cornerstone for a protected area, but it is a community-based initiative. I want to show you a first example. It's a video which comes from the Macan project. It's a video that comes from Snap, Quebec.
Kui hauni le da gadone Eric Canapé de nujin besamit de winebewt de ude usti mi nondish nuzamat wadme ude tchuni lan nuzamat wijiat me ilode wiruyat ude de nana gandozat niyan hanan wikhat nan khadabana wadme nilan tchue istmawil dmat mesini. نوت نتمت وي جفواد مد سينان نوت وي كلل دمت هابد وش ودو دي نتم جوان نيلان ودنا ماهيت دي مونا ودو دي وزبل دليونا نيه مامد نيل دمت دي دونا ودو دي نتم وت نانا يعني خدني يعني هنان كيه بيدات كيه كلل إنجش كنيلان وني واتو دمت كنيلان جش تجي Habde doasimenan que vilo y habogdado y nestobdo zi estamaldro que vilo nelo zitsel tan de wejito ken delden wodde wotbaji mamut sestarno kawapit magidlot zi to wotun jewan mamuet udan emlot zi mamut sanot de nigat isket zi wawiji nanot onen delden hamlot ne watu dantasio Miamni pi moane wa widansa. Ronin indelen pegu tasseon zi dudagansa. Kawa pit magilu mamut sit zit sedo. Abu bunant mi nagot kawa pit magilu zi wa wizi di hedo. Watu dojo walu. Hegnin dishne pi moagan wat fwa dansa. Mak tok de tat zit fwa daglat. Ronin indelen mist melunaroni tasseon wa dudan. Mamu. Ket zi hausman chuzmo. Zi uchistoaren, zi nan rauistoan. Nelo silo wat fwadar, tog wat fwadar. Zi la nu idlot. Tak dat tjutst moel manu, kist moel dak hoed nelo keifa pedat jawalu de kei huawija di lo echat. Zi pagasul, kasnu jawalu ihmile. Ke togolo zi habdet tat nit tak zi habde uden kulel damochne ehliwich, ehmamen nel damoch, ehtsel damoch. Zi Milando wasat habde. Agunevet delen mestiabdet nit sion wat udan zi mamu uchistagen, zi mamu teh kawa pit magilo. Den khamat no.
Why did I show this video? Because it's very important. Because word and oral transmission in the community is essential to succeed a project for Indigenous protected areas, because we're very confident and often a text, and it's something that we have to, we look at these different, we heard the Cree's initiatives as well, but so we have what is a Indigenous protected area. We talk about this in the participation at the community. In the past, the term protected area, the parks have connotations that are very negative and pejorative regarding our rights and our participation in the territory. Can't forget a lot of communities in the past had to deal with game wardens, park wardens, and moments of discrimination, and sometimes were prevented from going hunting, fishing, or gathering eggs on islands, and this had an impact on our relationship with protected areas. Is something said, Article 36, the right to ancestral practices of the Native communities. So we'll confirm these rights as well. So these are recognized under a law or a text. These are laws that are contained amongst each traditional practice and territory. So it varies according to the community that we're talking about. And the protected areas is a monolithic text, which was placed on territories and prevented the practice of traditional activities. So sometimes the communities question the concept of protected areas, especially when they prevent us from doing our traditional activities. So sometimes it goes against the conservation practices, because the Innu or the Cree, who is used to seeing the territory and how things happen, does not have the same reading of the traditional territory, and they can't see if which animal is present or which is an abundant or healthy, and the forests change as well according to the decades. So participation of this activity, I put this forward. I wanted to emphasize this. It's very important. And we come from the Band Council. These initiatives come from young people who are very mobilized, but people have a lot of doubt about protected areas, and there is people are bitter about what happened in the past. But yes, there are new practices being set up. We saw with some exchanges in Parks Canada with Ekwanshit, where now there is an exchange of services where the members of the communities are on traditional islands. Again, do make its practices in a much safer way without being threatened with arrest or fines. And also, they take part in preservation by making cultural presentation on islands for non-native tourists who come to visit. So this is a transformation that's very slow to come, because there are a lot of communities that don't want to integrate or invite non-native organizations or governmental organizations come into their community to talk about protected areas. I'm saying we protect our areas in our own way anyway. So by keeping this in the community, we stretch out our resources. We don't have access to certain funding that could be granted to the communities. And later this will be written. Why? Because we still have doubts about this with the funding from sometimes the communities find themselves underfunded, whether it's from the federal or provincial government for their participation. But it's extremely important for the community to participate. It's a question of make it or break it. It's something that could count for the success or failure of your project, basically, in a future perspective for our communities. I want to move on to the second video, please.
Everything is spirit, and whatever we do also to spirit.
This land does not belong to us, it belongs to the Creator, and it belongs to the species. We are not a higher being than they are.
Creation was all equal. I'm not better than the buffalo or the rock. We're equal. So that equality happened through creation. So when I look at protection and conservation, then I'm starting to look at it from that perspective of being a part of the environment.
Our long-term vision is for Canada to become a leader in the global community in regards to Euro-Indigenous collaboration around a really innovative leading-edge model of biodiversity conservation.
And now today, and yesterday, we're here in Canmore talking with Indigenous people from across Canada about how we can take the lessons, the teachings in the ICE report and apply it to real situations.
And we found that when we have the federal government, the provincial government, municipal governments, Indigenous people, nonprofits and others working together for a common cause and establishing protected and conserved areas or Indigenous protected and conserved areas, the result is very, very promising and bright.
So the October IPCA gathering is by Indigenous peoples and for Indigenous peoples. It's a unique period in Canadian history where First Nations, Inuit and Métis roles and responsibilities in conservation is finally being recognized. And so the gathering itself is being facilitated in ethical space. The gathering opens with the smudging and the opening prayer, recognizing the Treaty 7 Nakota territory that we're on. The sessions are designed and facilitated by Indigenous peoples and in partnership with our folks at CWS and the province of Alberta and others to ensure that, that we honor ethical space throughout.
But we really have to get everybody moving on this and have the respect that is cross-cultural, and that probably will take a little bit of time, but we need to encourage that. And that's one of the things I like about the National Nature Fund, is that it is going to encourage projects being brought forward, if you will, almost from a bottom-up perspective, where Indigenous peoples, whether Métis or First Nations, can bring forward a project and say, this is something that we would like. It allows them to make a declaration and seek a response from the other side or the other government, and create that cross-cultural learning and showcase it and build broader coalitions of support.
We've got to continue to walk the talk of ethical space. So we've been developing this solutions bundle, which is a marriage between a Western science toolkit and an Indigenous knowledge systems medicine bundle. And really what the solutions bundle is coming to be is a systems interface between two different worldviews to interact in an equitable, ethical way. The Indigenous Pathways Cooperative Alliance met in caucus for the first day and a half of the October IPCA gathering. That includes First Nations, the Assembly of First Nations as well, in an advocacy role as a national Indigenous organization on behalf of its 630 odd members. The Métis National Council of Canada, we have a strong contingent of Métis at the gathering and in caucus. And the Indigenous Leadership Initiative as well, Val Courtois, and several others from ILI were here to engage with the Indigenous Pathways Cooperative Alliance and the gathering on the whole, as well as the core members of the Indigenous Circle of Experts, plus several of the Indigenous members from the National Advisory Panel.
I think that the motivation of everyone is good. We just need to figure out how we work with each other. And the federal government or other jurisdictions working with First Nations, working with Inuit, working with the Métis Nation, we all have our own processes. We all have our own governance structures. We all have our own cultures and ideas and languages, and the way we use the land is just a little bit different. We're not the same from the coast of British Columbia to the Atlantic Ocean, we're to the Arctic Ocean. We all have our own ways of doing things, so I think that is respected. I feel that. I have talked a lot about capacity, and that's something that we need in order to generate those ideas to make sure that our backyards are looked after.
When we talk Indigenous protected areas, I mean, I envision our own people running beautiful places within our regions, teaching our culture to others, to respect and to work together, and share our traditional foods like we always do, and to share our Indigenous knowledge so that they can survive into the future along with us as well.
One of our teachings is water is life, and so I've been encouraging people here at the gathering to go out and see the headwaters, to know where the water comes from. There's a large connection here that we don't normally see. We're cut off by boundaries and other restrictions, so we don't really see the whole picture. And one of the reasons why we wanted to have the meeting here in Canmore was so that people would have some appreciation of that. Not only the Bow River, but the North Sask, the Athabasca, Fraser River, Mackenzie, like this is it. This is where water flows to the rest of the continent. This is how important this area is.
And IPCA, what distinguishes it from the other protected areas and conserved areas is the Indigenous inclusion and leadership. So they're important for many different reasons. The first that I can think of is for resurgence of Indigenous governance, Indigenous cultures and languages, and access to that land. The biggest thing is reconnecting to our relationship with the land, and that in turn will reconnect us to our culture, to our identity as Indigenous peoples throughout Canada.
Reality is in this country, in this day and age, you're not going to get stuff done. You're not going to conserve biodiversity in huge swaths of Canada. You're not going to turn species around from the declines they're in unless you have Indigenous support and they're at the table, and in effect often they're driving or co-driving what's happening.
I see those existing land use plans and some of the existing tribal parks and other kind of products that have been developed by Indigenous nations as worthy of recognition. And I often hear in our travels and work with different nations that the nations are doing this not just for themselves, but for everybody. There's, that cultural responsibility to land isn't just personal, it's about being good for the good of humanity. And so I think that there's space there for partnership and recognition and reconciliation.
That healing, that reconciliation between us as peoples is essential to not only objectives associated with justice, but it's only then that we can talk to each other. It's only then that we can take 10,000 years of baseline data on how to live on this land and bring that and work together to heal ourselves and the land. They're interconnected.
We've been trying to protect this earth for thousands of years, so just, walk with us. Let's walk together, we can do this.
This is the longest video that I presented. I like this combination between ancestral knowledge and the protection of the territory and a video which put forward by Canada.ca. It's a bit okay. Let's see how the government can help us protect conservation areas on our territory. So it's a message we'll hear a lot, and that's where we hear the great amount of fear that the money from protected areas will come from federal, provincial government or a governmental body. We'll see if we surrender our rights, are we losing our territorial rights? And that's something we will hear a lot because it isn't clear. Even the respect of ancestral rights and territorial rights is very difficult when we enter a nation-to-nation conversation. Remember that if we have a protected area project, which seems to be put forward by the government, whereas it's put forward by the community, this is where the issues of governance within the community are very important. We saw this with Sweden, what we started to understand in Canada, where there are ancestral rights and band chiefs. Who decides and what do they decide on? It's much more complicated than this. And this has to be discussed in the nations because Sweden, there's traditional and band chiefs aren't the same. And sometimes one person holds both titles, or some where they don't have traditional chiefs, or the territories are divided into family. It changes the governance aspect, especially when we have a traditional practice that varies. So we're starting to have discussion on governance and where we will find the power with this. But an Indigenous protected area and the direction this takes is it comes from the community. The community decides, and the decision can be, we will take our protected areas. We'll do it ourselves. We don't want anyone to help us, or we'll do co-management with the province, the municipality. What's extraordinary with this model is this is a very fluid model regarding what the communities want for their protected areas and also their capacity in the field. So this community of 10,000 people and a community of 300 inhabitants doesn't have the same realities and capacities. Community can be much denser, could have smaller territory. A community smaller might have an immense territory because they're in more remote areas. So it reduces a small community's capacity to manage a territory because they did it in the past. So we'll see how we will name things and how we'll determine the terminology within these protected areas, because when we'll talk between communities and the government, sometimes we talk to each other, we make agreements, we're not even talking about the same concepts. And that's rather unusual for people, because you say it's my territory, and I'll talk to someone from the government, and you'll say my territory, he'll hear it's a property with 4 posts on each corner of the territory. When I say my territory, I have an idea of the relationship as if I was talking about my mother and brother. I can't sell it, I'm just responsible for it. So we have to ensure this governance that comes from Indigenous communities has to come with the terminology and knowledge that comes from the communities, and not only the one that comes from the government, as it happened in the past, where they put direction frameworks on an area or a project. There was openness on Canada's part because the fund was put forward by the federal government to be able to increase the number of protected areas, because there's a percentage to reach, and this percentage is hard to attain without the presence or participation of Indigenous communities, because usually these protected areas are on the territory of the Indigenous nations. So often we have to include the communities. We cannot exclude them, because there'll be all kinds of problems. But when we include the communities, we'll ensure we'll increase our chances in succeeding in following through with this project. Also, what's important is that some communities have treaties, some have modern treaties, some communities have non-ceded territories, and these territories aren't managed the same way. We have our patrilineal or matrilineal system. This will transform the way of viewing the territory. But when we have the community take part, we have the opportunity to transmit a model that can be presented to the government that's structured, and to allow them to the government to understand it, but that respects how we have been protecting the territory for millennia. So I'll move on to the next video.
Meet the Indigenous Guardians from First Nations across Canada.
Guardian is somebody who manages and protects the land. Guardians have been here forever. There have been people who have given the land and the sea a voice.
Like when our traditional territories were taken away, or when our culture was taken away, a lot of people lost themselves and lost who they were as Indigenous peoples.
What I like about the Guardians program is that it's allowing us to now take our power back.
What do Indigenous Guardians do? Everything.
What I do day to day, I focus on patrolling, assisting with search and rescue, park management, we created our Guardian program to help with conservation efforts around regulation and enforcement.
We go out monthly to do staff gauge data collection on the rivers and streams within the traditional territory. And then we'll be moving into the morel mushroom monitoring season.
We also, for the last probably 16 years, have carried out species at risk programs in our community. We have looked at a variety of species. We do lake sturgeon, wood turtles.
Managing land is about more than conservation.
I feel like this Guardian program is able to get people back because we try to incorporate traditional knowledge, language, and I think just having that across all of these different First Nations is just amazing, and it'll help to revive the culture and language.
And that's where we need to heal as Indigenous people to become protectors again of our environment.
Looking after, you gotta look after Mother Earth regardless.
More than 60 Guardians programs are coming together to form a national network.
This Indigenous Guardians network has potential to be a leadership body to set an example for other people to follow.
In order to make change across Canada and potentially across the world, everybody has to come together.
We have the knowledge that can really help create a better future for everyone.
It's just more powerful when you work together.
Want more Guardians protecting the land? Sign up at landmeetsguardians.ca.
Native governance and being able to translate ancestral knowledge to make it understandable for the government. I think the Guardian project is one way to put forward these protected areas. We give training to community members to become guardians of the territory. We often consider ourselves as guardians, so why do we need this certification? Why do we become better guardians? Or it would involve that we would go hunting and we'd do traditional activities. But now I have example of the caribou now. We see the dwindling population. We don't have access to so much territory because we leave the caribou alone right now. We don't hunt it. How can we allow the Guardian to transmit this culture to the younger members of the communities and between the elders and adults? Well, they can create programs like this, and this will allow them to seek funding and donations. A lot of people have presented interest about to reach youth, people who are affected by climate change. And people are more interested to receive this transmission of cultural knowledge. So there's kinds of projects that can be set up. And this is a project that is great because it can be adapted to each community reality. So by putting this forward, I have the impression that we are structuring a traditional practice, but I think it'll rather allow us to make this shareable. And we can have best practices that use best practices that come from other communities. So we'll plan management of the territory. This is often in the reality. So how can we adapt when the caribou is no longer available? And when should we stop fishing for lobster, let's say, to let the stocks replenish? And sometimes others have provoked the changes and climate changes, but we're often the first ones to undergo the impacts. In Parc La Vérendrye, we see a lot of people from the traditional councils who are blocking access to sport hunters for moose, to allow the moose population to rest, to recover. Sending decisions to say you cannot prevent the hunters from hunting because they have their license, the permit. But when the members of the community is in danger, you have to let the population rest. It's a bit like a certification. We recognize the work of the people on the territory. This will allow us the community work to say you cannot go on the territory. The government should be able to collaborate with us. And also in restoration areas, there can be buffer zones close to protected areas. And this can allow us to do conservation practices in these protected areas even further. So these are original projects, come from the communities, and sometimes they don't require any costs because they're involved in, they're just part of traditional practices that continue to this day. And this has had an enormous impact on self-esteem, transmission, recognition as well, even within the communities. We have seen positive impacts on the Guardian project and also for the rangers as well. They go on the territory and we're able to connect high schools, elementary schools with this project. So this has helped people from the community to have structure to allow for funding to facilitate access to the territory. Sometimes you have to program this in a certain. I know that the break is here, so I'll come back after the break to tell you a little bit more about this regarding the management, as well as setting up of a scale economy and operation as well, and you'll understand even more what I'm saying. And we have to look at the human and the community point of view, which is to have something survive, something that's intimate and is collective regarding programs, which can seem to be disconnected and cold for us. That's why this should take place. And the things are, this makes things complicated. So we'll have you go have us a coffee, and we'll have you give you a break. So we'll continue. But it is really important to have the voice of the communities and have this message. It's also part of the planning of the territory. And go back to my last point, to be inspired by models that exist in different places. And also we can't forget that our models will be personalized to our realities. The exchange with the other communities really allowed me to understand at what point it was important. And the last example was the nation of on Vancouver Island, the Cliquoyet. I went to their protected area with Eli Hen, who is one of our experts on these projects. He talked about the protected areas, and he's talked about where this came from. It's a parallel, and I wondered, why can't we can't set up the same model, but we have so many parallels with the ancestral knowledge and the system for the protection of protected areas, but a governance model that couldn't be ours because, well, British Columbia have groups that were hunters and gatherers in such a rich territory that it's one of the rare groups who could stay on the same territory. And they created long houses, and they have systems around a certain sedentary lifestyle. But if we look at the models in Quebec on lower North Shore in the north, we're talking about hunters and gatherers who continue to always move, and they can't set up a permanent site. But they had permanent visit sites with territorial traces that are there, portage trails that have still been run through the soil since millennia. So I saw parallels. And one of the tools we used to talk about governance is we have a dugout canoe. It's a canoe that's been dug out of a cedar tree. And they looked at the different protected areas they created and looked at the different decisions, resources on the industrial practices that was in their territory. They were opposed to a kind of more traditional hydroelectric dam. And when they had this canoe present, they were able to claim ancestral rights. And now there are hydroelectric dams, but these dams are based on another model or another kind of dam. And they're based on the river currents with the least disturbance possible. And we talked about Indigenous protected areas, which are being planned, that will put forward. They will hit a wall, which is often the industry. We're talking about the industry in Quebec, logging, electricity, mines, and this is a very important resource regarding the provincial economy. So it's very difficult to work against these big players, drivers of the economy in Quebec when we want to protect certain areas. And we saw this in issues regarding caribou, like Val-d'Or caribou, the famous phrase that we're not going to stop logging for save one caribou. So we have big players with a lot of clout, with a lot of power, but we also, Indigenous rights as well are very powerful, and they are possessed by a community entity. So the participation of an industrial order can be seen as a way that can prevent the creation of protected areas. The magpie is harnessed by a dam, but still we can have a protected areas with a certain amount of co-management from the surrounding communities. Why is it important to talk about this? I said, you can do this project and that, but it's always the condition that the industry can say, share this, we give permits on 5 or 30 years to be able to work on a territory. But some communities in the past used this model, but for protected areas, we have even short-term permits, so we can have industrial practices of a certain type, a certain level, with the lowest possible impact over a short term. This changes the ideology of the certain industries on a territory. This communities that will be able to act to conserve certain territories, because often, as we see, the north is a big fridge, and that we open the door and we look for resources and we close the door, but we forget there are people living in this fridge. It's important for the boreal forest to be little disturbance as possible to allow the biodiversity to maintain a certain balance. And when we look at hectares or resources or physical resources, that's the non-native way of looking at it. But we will think about generational resources. So it's hard to hold these conversations when you're not on the same page. But protected areas remain important to minimize the impact of industries and the economy of extraction. This could sometimes be hard to address as well for these projects. We talk about the setting up of a healthy economy. We promote ecotourism or the picking of mushrooms or medicinal plants. It can become a problem because there's overpicking that happens. We have a problem on the lower North Shore with the gathering of with the cloudberries. They pick this in an abusive manner, or with equipment harms the environment, or they go blueberry picking. They go with rakes instead of just picking it by hand. So it could be an agreement on practices that are less intrusive on the territory, but we can have a control over these gathering practices to not overpick a place. So with traditional knowledge and traditional practices, we will allow them to avoid using up the resource, because when we talk about these protected areas, there are things that are developed over long periods. We talk about bogs or evergreen forest as well, and see how these industries that have infringed on these places now, because of economic needs of these places that were not that were undisturbed, are now being harvested or industrially used by the industry. So now I'll put a Facebook video on.
En naviguant le golfe Saint-Laurent, l'expédition Plancton Cosmique marie art et science dans l'infini. Dans cet épisode, on découvre les merveilles de la culture Innu, dans l'archipel de Mingan, une culture ancrée dans la nature environnante.
Ici, c'est les Wanjuminsto, Kadjegokia, Kadjegokiahis. Ici, c'est Kamagate. Kamagate, ça veut dire dans le sens comme s'il y aurait un grand rocher. Alors, Saint-Pierre, c'est Wepmsco. Puis ici, là, c'est Marti Kanipot. Marti, c'est le cèdre. Il y aura un cèdre ici, dans l'île.
Mon nom, c'est Rita Mstokusho, puis je suis très honorée de vous accueillir à Ekwanchit. Vous êtes arrivé par la mer, puis souvent les gens qui arrivent par la mer apportent des choses dans leur cœur, dans leur esprit, dans leur âme et dans leur corps. Quand on voyage par la mer, on voit au-delà de nous-mêmes, parce que des fois c'est l'infini, c'est l'eau. Il y a des choses qu'on ne voit pas, c'est invisible, mais on doit être ouvert quand on voyage sur l'eau à ce qu'on ne voit pas, mais qui existe.
Ils voulaient faire une pointe, mais c'était pas réussi. Ils ont comme abandonné.
Ah oui, ça c'est un clou, non? Oh. C'est une belle petite pointe sur éclat.
Bon, ma première!
Le programme d'archéologie d'Ekwanchit, ça fait partie de ce qu'on appelle l'archéologie communautaire. Donc, l'objectif, c'est de mettre en lien des archéologues professionnels avec la communauté Innu pour initier des recherches sur le territoire de la communauté. Avec cet outil-là, on va gratter le sol pour dégager des objets.
J'ai dit, il faut que j'essaye de trouver une pointe, puis des fois, j'allais voir l'arbre qui est là parce qu'il y avait un aigle. J'allais là, puis je faisais ça. Je veux trouver. Hier, quand j'ai trouvé,
Travailler dans ce contexte d'archéologie scientifique et surtout côtoyer ces gens-là qui ont vécu, partager les rires, on est sérieux, on travaille, on fait la science. Eux apprennent de nous et moi j'apprends beaucoup de choses d'eux, de comment est-ce qu'ils ont vécu, comment est-ce qu'ils vivent maintenant. Moi, c'est ça la clé. Moi, je me sens privilégié de partager cette culture avec eux.
Les scientifiques ont l'habitude de diviser les choses, de mettre la forêt dans une catégorie, la mer dans une catégorie, tu vois, ils les divisent. Et pourtant, ils sont reliés. Mes ancêtres, c'est ça qu'ils croyaient. Ils ne divisaient rien.
Des anciens regardaient la lune. Puis vous pouvez prévoir toute la température du mois. Ce que je souhaite quand je vois des rencontres là, qui est en lien avec les changements climatiques, avec l'environnement, c'est de trouver une façon d'allier les connaissances traditionnelles que les peuples autochtones ont avec la connaissance scientifique.
Je pense que s'il y avait plus de scientifiques dans notre monde qui considéraient l'interdépendance et l'unicité entre le vivant et le non-vivant, je crois qu'on serait plus apte à préserver notre environnement parce que là, on fait parler notre cœur aussi.
Une aire protégée autochtone se dessine à Equantit. La communauté souhaite y sauvegarder la forêt, la rivière et l'archipel à son embouchure, afin que les Inuits puissent continuer à occuper leur territoire et maintenir leurs traditions bien vivantes.
I love this film. Zarita Mistakushu, who's there, and Susie Bazil, who are two women who really taught me so much. They're just wonderful sources of information. How to use this to set up a healthy economy. They brought up other points regarding the relationship that they can establish with the conservation, with scientists, but they can also be with the economy as well. When we talk about a healthy economy, because often this was only in one direction. We talk about the decolonization of science, of protected areas, and there's a lot of confusion regarding decolonization. Said, oh, we're going to take out kick out all the non-natives and send them off in a boat. No, we're talking about maintaining practices, and often we have to protect this traditional knowledge, and also in the development of the economy of these areas that are planned, this traditional knowledge comes out. And this is one of the confessions that a lot of people from science and the conservation, they've often omitted ancestral knowledge. They didn't consider the elders' wisdom. That's one of the reasons why I'm working at the David Suzuki Foundation, because when I met with Mr. Suzuki the first time, he came to the Lower North Shore. There was a prize awarded to a project of local economy, which was Boreal, which is in Long Point, the Megan, and which is done in collaboration with the people from Nequanchit. They grow vegetables, so and it's hard to grow anything there. It's not a naturally fertile land for agriculture, but they managed to grow some, and they've made a circular economy and a place of teaching as well. So meeting this, the foundation gave them this project. I met with Mr. Suzuki and I said, I find this hard because, ancestral knowledge is like a science. It's not like science. It's bigger than science. Science, well, like Rita said, it will study things, very isolated things, but ancestral knowledge covers all of this, and they link one with the next. That's what science does. That really interested me with the foundation and the work he was doing. I realized that a subject that has really advanced for the respect of ancestral knowledge and the best practices in conservation. So we have the archaeology project that was developed in Mégan, and also, as I said, with Parks Canada. And this relationship, this allowed us to transform what was a totally closed and negative relationship, because a lot of archaeologists would come in, they dig, and they leave with all of the data and knowledge. And now we see the same thing with science and researchers who would come in with protected areas, who would close the areas. So we have areas that were accessible to the Indigenous communities and non-native communities, they get have practices on their territory. This is done in a joint effort, and which is done in a more widespread manner than just being concentrated on one part of the territory. And we talk about protected marine areas as well in the first couple of weeks, and we see how these areas were divided because the concept that was created was divisive. But the Inuit practice connected to Anticosti Island, and all of the practice for the salmon. So the salmon comes from the sea. So all of this was much more organic and connected than what was presented by bills, laws, projects, and presentations by ancestral practices, but with a recognition of ancestral rights and for the rights of Indigenous peoples in Canada. So instead of seeking the exact law that we need in the province or the federal government with these ancestral laws, we can create a new approach, which doesn't exist in a legal framework in Canada, but it still exists within our ancestral rights that, however, were recognized since the creation of Canada. Just to tell you that decolonization isn't the terminology we wanted to use. We talk about the re-indigenization of conservation of protected areas is very important. And I want to share another experience I had when I was at the UN, and I shared with other Native people throughout the planet in the past that protected areas were very negative for a lot of people. And the terminology we're talking about native practices, or the practices of non-natives in Africa. There are a lot of communities from different countries who said, when we hunted, they said that we were poachers. They said, we were going to hunt illegally. But if we put a white hunter there, he said, he's a sports hunter. He paid for his license. So even internationally, this terminology, this relationship between conservation of these native communities was still negative. It was seen as a way of taking the Indigenous people out of this environment. But in Canada, we're for a long time to work on this interaction and this decolonization, which will be much healthier. We talk about a healthier economy because we did stop basing economy on capitalism necessarily to go towards a community-based economy. And for Haitian, we talked about protected areas is quite large. We need funding. Secondly, we need community engagement as well, participation. We learn more about our community resources as well, because it has to be brought forward by the community. The community sees protection of a territory. They want to protect certain animals like caribou, and the herds are declining. But we compare this to, we talk about this as a food stock, but when we talk about the protected areas, we'll talk about hunters and people who are close to the territory, and they're totally interdependent on the territory. And once again, we see this as a way to prevent hunters from going to the territory and be managed by the community. Now you're part of the problem that we had for 50 years. So it's important to see how this decision has to be made in the community, because this can create very difficult decisions and could lead to accusations of colonization of band councils and members who want to create protected areas, because sometimes these places with the rules might prevent someone from hunting and feeding their family. So that's another consideration with traditional practices. The other challenge is to work with Indigenous and non-native communities at the same time. Like I said, the language isn't the same. The issues aren't the same. So that means sometimes we have to create a relationship, a basic relationship. Often these relationships were harmful to us, and it'll be hard to excuse when we have these negative connotations in the past, but when we have the possibility to live in the same territory and to work with another community that wants to live in the territory, it could be a way to protect ourselves against fly-in, fly-out practices or industrial practices, those who come in to an area and fly out after. This can create very strong alliances with local stakeholders and use many legal aspects in addition to Indigenous law. Okay, but put forward a combination that we haven't seen for ancestral rights, which is put forward by Indigenous communities. Another challenge is something that we didn't talk about or see because it's very sensitive. It's a question linked to identity. That's what we see presently, and issues for Western Métis to have their new Indigenous communities recognized, and others recognized under the Indian Act, the new C31s. But these are new recognized members who are not connected to their community of origin. So we'll see in the future how we could perhaps use protected areas to claim Indigenous areas and bring in people who weren't always connected to the territory. These could be issues, we'll say. But use this to camp in the woods, or they'll use this to go hunt, fish and gather and undermine and reduce the impact by the community. So these are more internal challenges, but externally there are many others, because we'll have opposition of the industry, which is very strong, and there'll be opposition of Indigenous members as well. We still use the speech of conservation to prevent certain rights, perhaps outside of Quebec. What's happening in Nova Scotia? Well, we use the speech of lobster conservation message to prevent members of the nation to go hunting outside of the season, but they continue to allow permits to the industry. So the people are afraid that the natives will be hunting or emptying the ocean, the seas, and the forests of animals if we let them do what they want. Before, they used to say that we were the ones who led to the decline of the caribou, and we said no, more industrial activity. So it could be restoration activity. So these are often brought forward by Native communities. So these are often open to many others. They can also put forward. This recognition exists internationally, and it's hard to recognize when it comes locally. And I'll share the report from the DS came out in May 2019 on the world state of biodiversity. In this report, instead of explaining there are a lot of species that are disappearing, there's, however, a recognition for all the protected areas that exist. The healthiest ones are the ones that the most effective ones are those managed by Native communities throughout the world. So we have an international recognition of Indigenous practices as being very effective conservation practices. However, resistance exists more locally, provincially, less federally. They're part of the project to create protected areas there. Also, issues between a province and the federal government and what's within. These are more traditional models and more on the ground, in the field, more intervention for protection. And we would like to have this recognized by the government to avoid having pressure on the communities. The communities have to mobilize on the field, whereas we should be able to recognize practices and not always force Indigenous human resources to protect this territory while they're managing other projects. Last challenge, and overworking community members as a problem. Before COVID, we had the wind in our sails to work on protected Indigenous areas in Quebec, and now this has slowed things down a lot because the community members wanted to keep the community safe, isolate the community, so the internal resources have been redirected towards emergency projects. Unfortunately, that's the case in the communities now. One last thing, French in Quebec. French is often an isolator for many communities. First of all, they speak their traditional language, and then French. And sometimes we'll see a discussion in all the provinces, and then it'll go to the Maritimes and go towards Labrador, and we won't see the Quebec models or the Quebec practices in Quebec put forward. Or we won't be connected to networks. We want to see when people aren't fluent in English, or the meetings aren't done with the simultaneous translation. And I'd like to thank the translator. That has to be recognized very much, because sometimes it's something that prevents us from working together, and it has to be recognized. Something that be many examples in the reports. I wanted to talk about people who are directly involved in the experience, and I want to talk about buffer zones. One of the things I don't often hear enough about when I go to meetings. And there's sometimes some communities get discouraged when some see some projects move ahead quickly, and other projects have a lot of investment, or other projects have resources which are much more attractive. When we talk about the local economy, fishing can be transformed much more locally, or for ecotourism. These are things that discourage the communities from moving ahead, because I said we don't have this or that, but we can be very creative in Quebec. That's one of our resources that stands out the most. We become very creative, and we're able to create a network within the provincial limits. What's important to connect with others to be able to move forward. I think it's a great path towards self-determination. We have a lot of issues on our plates, but everything that supports us as the territory, so we have to protect it while we have, even during COVID. We'll do what we can to protect our most important resource. So thank you very much. And thank you to my colleague for having presented the more traditional protected areas in a more structured way than I could have done so.